Welcome to the Dangerous Skills Podcast, where we explore issues of life, faith, and personal security. I'm your host, Charles Powell. Today, our guest is Tom Alibrando. Now, he's a degreed political science with Middle East and Foreign Affairs concentration. Tom was also a police officer and a SWAT officer for 11 years in Prescott, Arizona. And after that, he moved on to operating in various hotspots and war zones, including Iraq and Afghanistan, serving with the U.S. State Department and Blackwater in protective details. He also served as an intelligence specialist, assistant team leader, and counter-assault team member. While on deployment, he was often tasked with intel as it related to force protection, which meant studying the methods of attacks and pre-attack indicators. Now, that's important for us later in our discussions. In short, he's an expert at studying his enemy. That means a lot. He's a counterterrorism and narco-terrorism expert, and currently Tom is the lead instructor for the IWI Training Academy. Welcome with me, Tom Alibrando. Welcome again to the Dangerous Skills Podcast with Charles Powell and our guest today, Tom Alibrando, and we are, great to see you. Just all cards up on the table. We were recently together in person on the range doing a few cool things with IWI and Meprolite, and that was a lot of fun. But it was so great having you around. Things happening in the world. And I said to myself, with what happened in New Orleans, based on my background and my experiences out in the world back in my day, who do I want to talk to whose day is today? And Tom is that guy. So, well, thank you. Before we talk a little bit about what happened in New Orleans and other like situations and circumstances, I've been wanting to ask you this. I was thinking, what question did I not ask when you were here? Because we were busy doing things. But of all your federal, state, local assignments, doing everything from police to intelligence to high-risk protective, what was your favorite?
So that's a tough one because I'll be honest with you. I have a special place in my heart for the team that I was with for about 7 years back in Arizona. So we knew each other really well. We were the same mindset, and I got to the point where when we were doing our work, we didn't really have to talk to each other anymore. We just been around each other so much that everything just flowed really well. When I left overseas, obviously we're in these critical areas, and you have these people from these different backgrounds, and that was pretty cool too, because you now have this mix of talent outside of your normal world. I liked Erbil a lot. I liked being up north. The Kurds were great. Yeah. And believe it or not, it was a very austere environment, but Africa, when I ended up in Africa for a while, there's only 3 of us there. So we're kind of on our own in the middle of that environment. And it wasn't that it was pleasant, because it was very austere, the 5 hours of power a day, and it's you have to worry about malaria and stuff like that. But the people themselves, the ones we were training, were truly appreciative of it. And I still actually talk to a lot of those folks from that region to this day. Like, they'll still reach out, and so we established quite a connection there. We kind of changed the way they looked at training in that region, which was really awesome.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why I'm kind of drawn to people like yourself who have gone and done that thing, but they also are just really strong on training and training others. And from your time in law enforcement in Prescott, Arizona, and any other law enforcement you were doing there, what was your path like from where you were there to Blackwater? What did that look like?
No, that was it was weird. So when I wasn't actually going to be a cop, that wasn't my goal at all. I didn't grow up going, I want to be a cop. I was actually more mill driven. I did 2 years of Army ROTC when I went to school in Lynchburg, Virginia, and my knee got crushed. The military was being downsized. It just didn't seem
Yeah.
like a good option. But the knee, having screws in your knee was a no-go at the time because they were
Right.
trying to get rid of people. So I'm like, all right, what do I want to do in my life? I'm like, well, I want to kick indoors, right? So somewhere. So I ended up doing law enforcement, like to try it and see what it was like. Turned out I liked it. I was pretty good at it. And I went into it with the idea of helping people, right? Think outside the box and help folks. You're a servant. You're not, I wasn't going into it like I need to tell people what to do. That's not how I wanted to do it. But I wanted to get on SWAT because that was hard. So my whole goal when I got into the agency was to be a SWAT guy. I ended up going to a whole bunch of shooting schools on my own. Matter of fact, I think 80% of the training I paid for out of pocket to the point where I was reloading ammunition to afford it because you're a poor cop. I went to Camp Pendleton for sniper school with the Marines. It was a 6-day sniper school. It was in
Wow.
between their sessions with State Platoon. And I had to hand load 500 rounds of match ammo because they wouldn't give it to me. And I
Wow.
was already on the team when that happened. And they're like, no, we're not doing that. I'm like, it's the Marines. Let's learn what they have to give, right? Because they're good at that kind of thing. So I ended up getting on the SWAT team in about 3.5 years, which was a bit, I'm not going to say it was, at the time, it was unusual because usually you had about 4 to 5 years on before you get on the SWAT team. They want to know that you're mature. They want to know, how you deal with things. I'd already had all the schools, and it came down to, I had a fairly good reputation on the street, and I would, engage and, make good decisions for the most part. I mean, everybody makes their bad decisions. There's no doubt about that, but
Right.
mostly good decisions, and I was reliable. And then I got on the team. I was on the team for, I think, 3 years just as a sniper assaulter. And then I ended up after 3 years being the trainer for the team. So I took over training the team, and I did. I changed some things up. We needed to update and upgrade. And before I
It
did that,
it
I went
sounds to
out.
me like that investment in training that you did and yourself paid off.
Yeah, it did. It actually, I didn't know where it was going to go. I'll be honest with you. I had no clue. So I was going out to gun site constantly, and I was actually teaching on the side as well. So for another guy who was there, who was my sergeant actually. So, but I went out and I sought out different ways of doing CQB. I'm like, okay, this is what we do now, but what else is there that's better? And I had buddies that were SEALs already. So I was talking to them and I was reviewing different ways of doing it. And I actually was able to lock down a different way, a new way of doing it. We did a lot of entries at the time in the early days where you had a CI or confidential informant that would draw out what the house looked like, and you kind of try and plan what it looked like. And the reality is that CI was high as a kite. The rooms were nowhere near the size. There was rooms that he didn't know about. He's not looking at it from our point of view. So when I got in there, and we were pretty good at blind entries, but we really focused on, I don't know what the inside looks like, and it doesn't matter because this is what we're going to do. And that really paid off, and it worked really well. So it was, in the time that I'm doing that, I'm also teaching sniper stuff, and I'm teaching at the academy. So the academy was, because I did political science. I did a foreign affairs concentration, but
Yes.
you have to take constitutional law, and I enjoyed constitutional law, so I got into it. So I wasn't just teaching firearms at the academy. I was actually doing search and seizure related things because they had attorneys that would go in and they would talk about these very broad Fourth Amendment concepts, and that's great. Here's case law, and then they say some words in Latin. Good luck, and out the door. And they're like, well, we need somebody who can translate this to street, right? So here's a broad concept. How does that apply to a traffic stop? How does that apply to, knocking on the door and smelling or seeing, some kind of illegal act inside the house? And how do you deal with that? So I could translate Latin to street. And before I did that, obviously, I want to, going back to my constitutional law part, which I had no idea if that was going to apply to what I was doing law enforcement wise. It really did. And I would sit down with I had a county attorney in particular, and one of the judges in my academy, who was my criminal law instructor, I would actually go see him. We were friends after the academy, and I actually was in his court every so often. But I was one of those guys. I'd go in and I'd argue with the city attorney once in a while on something case law wise, which was really good. He's a judge now too, by the way. So it was good that I had all these touch points to make sure, okay, this is what I want to present. This is how I want to deal with it. And they were like, do it. And I remember her sitting in the back of the classroom as I'm going through my Fourth Amendment stuff. She's like, yeah, you're spot on. You're good. You got it. Criminal law, to be honest with you, compared to civil law I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's easier
Yes.
because there's a degree of, finality in establishing certain, what do you call it? I'm looking for the term here, but if you establish certain criteria, you have a crime, right?
Yes.
As long as you can establish that criteria.
If you have these elements, you have a crime.
Yeah, exactly. So, and that's what it kind of came down to, is if you can establish that, you're good to go. So that part I could get pretty easily. And then I left that. Well, actually, I was in law enforcement, and I ended up getting a phone call. So in my travels doing the private training thing, somehow somebody got my name, and I think it was a Canadian guy that I went to sniper school with at McMillan Sniper School. I did a lot of schools.
Yes.
It was a lot of schools. And I got a phone call from Blackwater at the time, and I knew about them. We heard about them out west, but didn't know exactly how involved they were with government contracts. I mean, they were just getting into it really, and they were established in like 97, 96, but they didn't really start getting their first contracts until the coal incident. When the coal happened, then they started getting it, and obviously that's when things started taking off for Eric. But I got a call that said, hey, we have this thing coming up. You're qualified. Your name popped up. Can you come out? And I'm like, okay, when do you need me there? They're like, well, we need you here in about 3 days. And I'm like, what? Right. So had to go to my chief. Hey, I need to, try and take a leave of absence. He wasn't real happy because I just switched into a different position, out of patrol and into something else. And he's like, well, okay. Initially, he was okay with it, and then he wasn't okay with it. I found out about that when I left. He says, okay, you got to do what you got to do. And in my mind, yeah, the money was attractive, but it wasn't just that. It was the fact that there was all this stuff going on. I was with towers happen, and I'm like, I got to do more. I mean, this is great. I need to, support the community. There's nothing wrong. That's God's work. I get it. But I wanted to do something else that kind of had more of an application worldwide. So I went out, and 3 days later, I show up at Moyock, North Carolina, and they're holding us up in Elizabeth City in a hotel because they didn't have the ability to house us on site then. It was much smaller. And it was DS Class 1. We were the very first class. Didn't know that until we showed up. But yeah, we were number one. And we had 78 people to start. And throughout I think it was about a 30 or 40-day training process, which turned out to be partly selection.
Yes.
So they were getting people as they were going. We whittled it down to about 45. And some people left. Some people didn't make the PT test. Some people couldn't shoot. Gone, right? So you're out. And then after that, I came home for, I think, 3 days. They allowed me to get my affairs in order for 3 days. And then I shipped from Arizona to Iraq pretty quickly after that.
What year was that?
04.
04.
This is the early part of the war.
Mm-hmm.
I was there when it was the Coalition Provisional Authority.
Yep.
I actually have a coin over here with CPA on it, right? It says Coalition Provisional Authority.
Right.
And then it switched over. We, handed it back over. And the way we did that in retrospect, at the time, it sort of made sense. They're talking you into how things are going, and you're not there for the politics part of it. You're there to protect the politicians, really.
Right. Those were the days of Bremer.
It was Bremer and then Negroponte.
Yep.
And Bremer came out and then Negroponte came in.
Yep.
And he was definitely a different type of ambassador. So, and there was other ambassadors there. There wasn't just those two. There was actually another ambassador, Jeffries.
Right.
We protected him and some other folks. So you had to have all these various teams, and all these teams had to go in outside the green zone and have face-to-face conversations with folks. And some of them are military, they're colonels and generals. Some of them are political attachés from different segments, right? So we stood up a bunch of teams. It was split between us and Dynacorp, believe it or not. So because it was too big for just us.
Yeah,
So
they needed a lot of qualified people quickly.
They did. And Dynacorp was there first. When we showed up at the compound, and we literally lived for the first month in it was a 60-man tent with these giant refrigerator-sized air conditioners. And it was hot in the day, and it was 45 degrees at night with rats running around. So it was a good time.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we had to secure our gear wherever we could, because it was a common area. It was a tent that was designed for people that were flying in or flying out. It was just a place
transitional.
Yeah. It was
So
transition. Yeah.
tell me about the background of the people you work with. You're obviously a man who appreciates team and training and cohesive relationships. What were the backgrounds? What were the kind of guys that you work with on your team there?
It was everybody. We had Rangers, we had Marines, SF, the token SEAL here and there, and some law enforcement from all over the country. I had a guy who drove for me. He was from Texas. Technically, I was from Arizona. We had another officer from North Carolina, but it was kind of everywhere in between, and mostly combat MOSs. So they were either infantry, they were reconnaissance Marines, or they were scout snipers or something like that. So it was, SF guys, are kind of. It was funny because when we got to the embassy, you have this mess hall. It seemed like all the groups, their Wonder Twin rings would glow when they would find each other. And that I kind of made fun of the SF guys more than anything for that, because they had the De Oppressor Liber rings on all the time. Oh, do you know Master Sergeant so-and-so? Who's your team, sir? Oh, I know that guy.
Oh, yeah. It's like it's almost like two dogs sniffing each other when they meet,
It kind of is. And, everybody the Rangers kind of gravitated, with Rangers and stuff like that. But it was actually a pretty good combo, because everybody had their different specialties. And because we had so many different backgrounds in that environment, it was actually better. It took us a couple of weeks to kind of figure each other out, because all the training we did stateside, to be honest with you, was for semi-permissive environments. So DSS had never dealt with anything like this before. They only knew what they knew based on their training cycles that they had in the U.S. and their permissive environments that they'd been to in most embassies. So now you're in an environment where, the insurgency is ramping up because we got rid of the Ba'ath Party and we got rid of the military, and that created the insurgency. Really, that's what started it.
Well, I don't want to go down a rabbit hole here, but I cannot discuss that topic with you and not ask this question. What is your most dangerous or hated road or road route that you had to regularly take?
Irish was the worst.
Everybody always tells me Irish.
It's Irish. Haifa was the other bad one. If we did anything on Haifa, we tried to. So I was in charge of routes. That was part of the intel part. I got all it's called SIGACs, significant actions that happen. And I would try and get our routes where I could just stay off of Haifa. But if I had to get on it for a brief time, I would make it as short as possible, just because they're, tossing grenades and stuff from balconies and things like that. So that was pretty rough. But Irish was hands down the most dangerous road in that entire country. It was 6.5, 7 kilometers long. But what it did was it went from the airport to the green zone, and it was a route you had to be on.
Yeah.
Huge road. And the way the city was near it, there were points where the city was kind of right next to it. And there were other ones where you had to stand off of about 50 to 75 meters. There was like a retaining wall, and then the city was right there. Perfect for setting up a machine gun. The Edinburgh Risk guys got lit up in that area. They were stopped kind of in the middle, where you had that standoff from the city, and that's where they got hit.
When Kris Paranto talks about Irish, he talks about you do everything you can do, you plan as best as you can plan, but at the end of the day, it's a numbers game.
Yeah, him and I worked together on Irish. That was it. So yeah, I was his assistant team leader when I was in Iraq, and then I switched off of that team and went to from team 4 to team 2. And then I ended up working with Boone.
Oh, get out.
Yeah, I worked with both of them.
Yeah, well, I've interacted with Kris about the work we have done fighting human trafficking. We've actually done, actual kick in the doors and do, actually free people from their organized crime group that's got them. And we breeze in, take them, breeze out. Nobody hardly knew we were ever even there. And, Kris is always, every time I see him again, and he's like, I'd love to go on one of those raids with you guys. It's funny. Guys like you, Kris, Boone, guys like you are always ready to grab my gear, hop in and go do something. Yeah.
Oh yeah. No, that was being on offense is way better than being on defense. We were on defense there, which I didn't like. And that's why when I switched over to QRF, that's more, it's defense, but it's offense, right? So, Humvees, we're not hiding anything.
Right.
We're just there to roll them up, right? So that's the idea.
Well, I always tease the SEALs because every time one of them is like, hey, we'd like to go with you and do this human trafficking thing with you. I said, no, I need people that can go do dirty deeds and go home and not write a book about it. If it's okay with you, we'll just stick with we'll stick with law enforcement and we'll stick with special forces guys and be done. Anyway, let's transition a little bit. Give us your insights on the recent terrorist incident in New Orleans from a police perspective. What went right? What went wrong? What did you see that made you want to throw something at the television, if anything?
The only thing that I think that went right is, and if you watch the video carefully, I don't think they realized that what he did was intentional because they didn't really have their guns out when they approached the vehicle.
Right.
But they responded immediately and neutralized them. So he had 2 other devices and then one in the truck that he didn't set off. And the problem I have with the whole thing is, the FBI is the FBI. Yeah. I think they're playing certain things in this whole thing because November, I remember initially when it happened, they talked about travel to Egypt. He went to Egypt, then he came back, right? So, and he got radicalized around 2007 or when he got divorced from his wife. I want to say it was 2017, but he's been going down this primrose path headed this way. And he was, an IT, he's a fairly intelligent guy, right? This is not a dumb guy. So the one thing that went right is they engaged him right away. And I guess he had a remote to set the bombs off. So if they hadn't engaged him right away, then it might have been more catastrophic. Everything else was wrong. As a matter of fact, the city in general, so everybody was talking about how they had vehicles as barricades. The reality is the barricades that they had in place, I don't know if you saw this report from a few days ago, were not designed to handle that anyway.
No.
They were designed to handle a car going 10 miles an hour.
Right.
So they're really for show. So the reality is this, were they prepared for that at all? The answer is no. Nobody was. I think New York and LA get the most hype. Those are obvious targets that, it is everything that particular group loathes, right?
Right.
It's money, power, whatever. So they would love to hit those cities. The problem is those cities have such a presence and are more prepared and have so many more officers and resources that they're hardened a little bit, right? After 9/11, right, New York is very sensitive to that kind of attack.
Yes.
And they know how to deal with it really well. So if you get into targeting, bad guys do targeting as well. They assess targets. You want certain things. You want something that is very Americana, something you loathe. Obviously, the French Quarter has a certain reputation, right? Right. So,
yes.
So that's kind of a cool target. It also is not as well protected. It's not as well thought of, yet there's press and a lot of resources nearby to get visuals on it.
No, I used to live outside New Orleans, and I spent some time in the quarter. And, I know they had these removable concrete bollards that they can put in the way. And I know they had a police car at the end of by Canal. And of course, you listen to the chief, and she's like, well, we had it blocked off. We had it, it was a target. It was hardened, but he went around it. He went up on the sidewalk, almost kind of like he didn't play fair. And I'm like, really?
Yeah, well, he scouted it. You could tell by the way he drove that he already knew the path. Like he'd been by it. He already had the meta glasses and he was recording everything.
I saw the bicycle visit that he took. And, so many smart things. The vehicle, I'm very familiar with those kinds of vehicles, and they don't make a lot of noise, but they are very, very heavy. And a truck, the F-150 Lightning, it has a tremendous amount of torque. And from the time he turned the corner and got to a high speed, it was very, very quickly.
Yeah, so I honestly believe that he's showing capability beyond what he got in the Army.
Yeah.
So the Army's going to train you. He's an IT guy. He did human resources. Okay, so for him to scout that out in that professional a way tells me that when he goes to Egypt, he went somewhere else.
Oh yeah.
And he actually got formal training on how to do this. So I think that's really getting underrepresented. And guys over there, ISIS and general Al-Qaeda, whatever, they're looking for guys like that.
Yes.
Who actually are very intelligent, who have an American passport, who aren't going to get looked at as hard. And that's the thing is, a lot of the terrorists or whatever that are going to come to the country, they're going to do a lot of things to mitigate anything to even get looked at.
Oh yeah.
The Saudis that came here that flew into the buildings, right? They had passports, visa. They're Saudi Arabia. They're technically a friendly country.
Yes. Well, people like Sarah Adams, and I'm a big fan personally. I'm a huge fan of Sarah, and Boone. I really have a lot of respect for them. They're my kind of intelligence people. Sarah, the way she talks, the way she approaches things. Sarah has talked about the aspect that, Al-Qaeda right now in its current iteration, working with ISIS and others, creating this whole new group, are basically looking for people like the New Orleans terrorist attacker that can be radicalized and do these one-off lone wolf type attacks, and then put it over on ISIS. And it said, look, we want to make sure, and Sarah has sounded an alarm that we have another 9/11 type event coming our way, and more of an October 7th, what happened in Israel type attack across the homeland here. Not just in New York and LA, but, in small towns and medium. You never know what small town. And looking at doing swarm attacks like in Mumbai with a trained fighter that's more of a Fedayeen type, which someone who will fight and then blow themselves up in the end. They'll shoot, they'll fight, they're going to die in the process and take as many people with them as possible. Now, how prepared is the average police force to deal with such an incident like a swarm type attack? Because even the Indians, you would have thought, might have been better prepared for something like that, and they were absolutely not.
No, they weren't going to be. They're not at that level, to be honest. I mean, their special units are, but they're regular. No, they're doing it because they need a job, and there's not much going on. Right?
So in the U.S., the average homeland, small city, small town, county, because the homeland part of the attack will probably stick and hurt the most.
So I actually look at this as it's going to be more like New Orleans or St. Louis or some other city that's big enough to attract a lot of attention and get a lot of press. So you remember Beslan?
Oh yes,
that was kind of the origin of that type tech. There was 49 assaulters in that one, so 49 bad guys. So, and they're Chechens, and they held the school for a while, and it was huge. It was a disaster, right? The whole thing went bad. 350 hostages killed, kids, right? So
and one of the things, of course, they used they had new approach, and the cops outside, government people, old mindset, let's negotiate. Meanwhile, they're in there cutting throats.
There was no negotiating. It was just to drag it out, get more press.
Oh yeah, that's right.
You'll notice though the area they chose, it was a bigger city. It's not going to be like some small town. It's going to be, if they're going to do that kind of, the thing about swarm attacks is it creates more of a footprint and a more chance for discovery. That's the biggest issue, right? There's got to be chatter, there's got to be coordination, and that's the one thing our SIGINT here is pretty good at, is developing that and going after that. The hardest thing is the individual, because this guy basically, American citizen, had no footprint that they were tracking at all,
Right.
even though he'd flown to Egypt and
Yes.
did all this stuff and, left the army. And, so there were some things there. And I think that's another reason the FBI is like, not want to touch it, because it's like, how come this guy didn't show up on your radar?
Right.
You got to understand, I'm not blaming the FBI, because I'll be honest with you, their amount of people and their ability to digest all that information and single out a target it's very daunting.
Yes.
It's very hard. And there's always this balance, this argument about, security and, and surveillance. So,
well, I've had folks on the street want to attack the FBI because they're not doing more about human trafficking. And I'm like, do you realize what the average day is for an FBI agent coming into the office? They come in, they're trying to work on some old cases. They get a call, a bank's been robbed. They have to go work the bank robbery. That takes most of the day. They don't have enough people to do all the things they have to do anyway and figure out a way to end human trafficking. So I don't think people really understand. And it is daunting, like you said, trying to find an answer and to track people. Yeah,
their counterterrorist thing is probably after 2001, they were doing drugs before 9/11. So they're like, let's give that back to the DEA. It's like, well, they should have had it the whole time, but okay. So yeah, they're overtasked and they're undermanned. So as much as I kind of make fun of the FBI a little bit, they're trying. I think there's guys on the ground that are trying to do the right thing and see it, but it's tough to pick out. A swarm attack would be bad. An individual attack, I would say that more now than most, because of a byproduct of active shooters in schools. That's kind of an active shooter scenario.
Yes.
And officers throughout the country over the last 20 years have all had some training in how to deal with that and go right after it. And I remember doing active shooter training when I was an initial officer, and then towards the end, it started changing. And then obviously we were teaching it at Blackwater to agencies as well. And we morphed it again and again and again until we got it where it made the most sense.
Well, what can local police agencies do, across the homeland to prepare?
It's tough. I think you have to focus on the cities that are most vulnerable first. Again, if you want to, you have to look at this, you have to war game it from their side, right? So part of strategy in whether it's conventional or non-conventional, asymmetric warfare, is you got to step into your guy's shoes and go, how would I do this? And I did that all the time when I was doing my thing, like planning and plotting, whatever. And it's that what if game. If this happens, this is what I'm going to do, right? So I would identify the cities first, and then I would go over common attacks or vulnerabilities next, and then see what that would look like putting barricades in certain streets during certain time, things like that, right? Having that already set in the ground where you could just raise those things and do it. I know that there's some countries in Europe that do that a little bit more than we do because they've been hit more.
Yes.
Europe had, they had bombs going off in buses. Britain did, a long time ago. So they're always trying to identify those things, right? I think the country in general, our country is so big, it's harder to manage. Mm-hmm. So you're looking at Israel. Israel's been at war forever. They have a lot of things in place. Like they have active shooters or active stabbers there. And you'll notice two things that they do is they neutralize them quickly and they don't talk about the guys. They these guys were shot, they were killed. Not going to tell you who they are. They might say they were Palestinian or whatever, but for the most part, they're not going to advertise that individual because they don't want to create another guy who's going to want to jump in his shoes.
Yeah, right.
So dealing with a country the size of New Jersey, I'm not going to say it's easy because they have a lot of pressure on them, obviously. Right. And dealing with a country like ours where, from Houston to, freaking, go all the way up to Fargo, North Dakota, right? Are they going to hit Fargo? I don't know that Fargo is a primary target, right? So I would start eliminating things that are not as predominant and I would start looking at major events that are always on TV that you
Right.
want to get ahead of. Mostly major events like, Super Bowls, Houston, places like Houston, Dallas, Philadelphia, whatever. When they have a major event, there is a segment where they're thinking about that.
Sure.
I think bigger cities. That's why like cities like New Orleans kind of fall out of that because nobody's thinking about New Orleans for terrorist attack, right? So I'd identify those cities that are big enough but not identified yet, and that's where I would start kind of pouring resources and training into,
You know,
and maybe
I spoke with
infrastructure.
a law enforcement agency that has like 90,000 people in their stadium on a regular basis. And I just figured that they probably had those special events, special trained snipers in place somewhere. And they're like, no, we don't have anything. We have no response whatsoever.
Yeah, no, that's not good. I don't know that you want to put snipers up on the rooftop every time you have a Super Bowl, but um, plain clothes,
Yeah.
walking around. There's actually guys that are they're specially trained in some airports in some countries. They're profilers. They look at behavior. Right?
Oh,
Cops
wow.
are good at that. That was the one thing when I was overseas. Let me backtrack for a second. Remember, I said we had these different guys that I was working with.
Right.
Everybody really had their specialties, and what I mean by that is cops are pretty good at figuring out human behavior.
Oh,
Like that
yes.
doesn't look right. The way he's standing, the way he's posturing, we have a pretty good BS detector too,
Oh,
and
yeah.
no matter what language, we know what nervous looks like, right?
Yeah.
So, and we had guys that were my primary saw gunner was a ranger. He's pretty good at, looking at terrain and figuring out avenues of approach and things like that we had to determine. Everybody, I had a guy, he was an SF cat on my team who is actually a communications guy. He's a comm guy. So he's an SF guy. He's a shooter. But when we did our own advances, just to give you, how to use your guys, I was the assistant team leader. So I wasn't the TL, but I was the assistant team leader. And my job when we came to a site was to get advances. We didn't have an advance team at the time. So we had to do it ourselves while we were there. And I'd bring Sly up with me and I go, hey, what do you see around us? And he could look at the different antenna arrays and dishes and tell me what was a news station, what was a regular building, and what was military.
Wow.
Just looking at the tops. I'm like, that's what I'm talking about. You got to use those guys.
Skills.
Yeah. And everybody, it really gelled well. We had all these different backgrounds. And like I said, for the first 2 weeks, it was kind of weird because I'm digressing a little bit. So sorry. But
Yeah.
we had all these different skill sets. But we figured each other out. We knew each other word. Here's a cop saying, hey, guys, let's do this. Who are you, right?
Right.
You're not a ranger, right? I'm not, but does it make sense what I'm saying? Yes. And we all gelled. We did really well with each other. We worked very well, but it was nice having those different backgrounds. I think it made us stronger in some ways rather than
Yes.
having one thing. You had everything.
Okay, so you've got an everyday citizen, works at a factory, works at an office, just an everyday person. How might they prepare? How might they prepare ahead or live their lives in such a way as to prepare for this sort of a thing? Because whether it's in their city or not, it will affect them. Or what kind of posture? How do they need to prepare in the world we're in, looking forward to this event?
That's a tough one, and the reason I say that is because the average citizen is oblivious to this.
Yeah.
So the only way, again, I'm not going to say it falls to the government, but and you don't want to make your citizens feel weird either, right? So there's this part where if I'm in New Orleans, like New Orleans right now, those businesses are probably more aware of how they would do it over again if they could, right? That was a vehicle attack, by the way. So they have a tendency to change things up.
Mm-hmm.
So because if they do one thing over and over again, you start getting used to it. And you
Sure.
get better at it. It's the usual thing. I think they have to be aware that that's a possibility in the first place. New Yorkers, if you go to New York, they're aware that there could be a terrorist attack there. They're in New York. It's a primary hub. If you go to, Knoxville, Tennessee, they may not be as in tune with that. So I think the first thing is for them to be aware of that in the first place. And if they're not, then that's an issue, right? And then what would that attack look like? And what can they do based on the attack? If somebody runs into the building and starts shooting the place up like Mumbai, well, we already have a protocol for that, and that was for schools, right? It was
Right.
lock and place. It was hide, fight, or run, right? There's your three choices right there. Bombs in general are very difficult to deal
Right.
with. Point blank. You got to get away, isolate, call EOD, let them deal with it if you can identify it in the first place. So it's really a tough thing to say, well, how do you prepare for that? Well, I mean, the obvious thing is if you have a lot more concealed carrying holders in that area and the guy's an active shooter, the chances of him being neutralized quicker it's a matter of how many can you save, not how many you're going to lose,
Right.
Then the chances of him getting shot by somebody with a CCW, pretty high, right?
Yeah. Welcome to Georgia, man.
Yeah.
Lot of concealed carry here. I
You go
mean,
to
even in church,
Massachusetts, yeah,
even
you
in
go to
church.
Massachusetts, Boston,
Uh-huh.
probably not a lot of concealed carry there, but there's a lot of cops,
Yes.
and they dealt with the Tsarnaev brothers, whatever,
Yes.
up there
Mhm.
blowing up Boston Marathon. So
Right.
you're probably a little bit more prepared. Maybe they've gotten lax over the years. So if you don't have an attack after a while, people are like, okay, that was it, we're done, and they kind of back off. But that's a tough question, and I think it's just a matter of, hey, be aware, and if something doesn't look right, call it in, because they have to show up, they have to scout the area out first, and if you can get ahead of that and get response started that way, you can minimize how much damage they can do.
Well, I'm
Right?
going to go off script here. I was going to go a couple of different ways, but I'm going to go off script here because you've done such a good job of answering some of the even sort of follow-up questions. Let's say a person decides to take responsibility and use their Second Amendment rights. They get with some people. They actually get an adequate firearm for concealed carry and/or home. What would you say to them about what kind of training that they need to get? And, even from like beginning to intermediate to further on, what kind of training would you suggest these quote average citizens get for themselves?
Well, I would research who good instructors are. And by the way, good instructors are lesser than you think. There's a lot of instructors out there now. It's become an industry, and there's some folks that are very good, and there's a bunch. But I would research who the instructor is and see if that they're getting realistic training. Okay, I saw one guy doing some kind of gun kata situation, you knife in one hand, gun in the other. You're like, what the are you doing, right? So it's kind of dumb, but so make sure you get somebody who's competent, first of all. Second of all, understand that it for training like this, a lot of people think that they go to a school for 2 days or 3 days and they've got some kind of inoculation and now they know how to shoot. They're ninjas. You're not.
Right.
It's like any fighting skill, you have to keep it up. So go to a school, and then after you learn from that individual, go out and practice yourself. But by researching that person, make sure they're doing something that's realistic and relevant to what you're doing. So what I mean by that is when I'm teaching civilians like pistol stuff, I'm teaching them to be an individual person dealing with a problem. I actually advocate, if you can avoid shooting somebody or if you can avoid getting into a shooting, avoid it. Right?
Absolutely.
Based on what you're doing, obviously. Guy with an AK running around shooting people, that's kind of a no-brainer. You're interceding, then that makes sense, right? But if you can avoid it. So
Yes.
you got to be careful about the rah guys who are like kill, kill, kill,
Right.
and working CQB when realistically you're going to be by yourself with your family.
Yes.
Having your family with you, that changes your tactics too, because I got to protect them and deal with the problem.
Right.
So I'm drawing fire. How do I draw fire away from them and neutralize, suspect without hitting anyone else? It's hard. And if you think about what you're doing, you've got to get the right instructor, get the good training baseline, and then go out and train yourself, understanding ahead of time that no matter how good you get, no matter how good Tom is, I know that under actual stress, my accuracy is going to drop off some. There's no
Everybody.
way around, right?
Yep.
It's stress. That's just the way life is. But the better off you are, the better your baseline is, the more effective you're going to be. So when I teach academy courses, IWI, we stress that. We stress accuracy, consistency, doing a lot of reps to try and get that neural pathway
Mm-hmm.
down. But then at the end of it, I'll always tell them, hey, you got to go out and practice because you're going to lose it all.
It is
goes
a
away
perishable skill.
very much. Just like learning, if I had to wrestle somebody right now, it probably would be pretty ugly because I haven't wrestled in a long time. When you do it all the time, great. My
It's a
DT is
different thing.
good, but I don't do it a lot.
Got it.
So I know I've lost some.
One last question here, and you've kind of hit on it already. What can we do in our country as a whole? What is it citizens can get behind in general, conceptually, philosophically, to get on a better security footing throughout the country? What I call homeland areas, areas outside the beltways, if you will.
Outside the Beltway, meaning Washington?
Meaning like outside of Washington in New York and LA, what a lot of those folks call the flyover country.
So the reality is there's a couple of ways we could attack this. Obviously, we got to secure the border thing. I don't know why that's even a debate, securing a border. I don't get that. You don't let somebody into your house who you don't know who they are, right?
Yeah.
I think honestly, to a point, those that are here, I mean, we have obvious criminals that we need to get rid of. And inside of those elements are cells. So perfect example is Trindalagua, TDA.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know this, or you probably do. I don't know. But believe it or not, that gang is more organized than anybody gives it credit for.
Oh, yeah.
And Maduro has control over that gang from Venezuela. The reason he doesn't want them back is that's a projection of what he wants to do.
It's forced projection for him.
It's a projection for him. It's a very cheap projection too, because they get money and they do things anyway, so they're self-sufficient.
Right.
And they establish their own little web of whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But he gets to use them, and nobody's aware of that, right? So getting rid of those threats, getting rid of threats that, hey, this guy came in, but we really don't know who he is, and we suspect that he is really bad dude.
Yeah.
Right. He's been to these countries that we kind of know of. Why just, why keep them there? We need to get rid of them. Right. And then I think going back, and then our vetting process for bringing people in is ridiculous. It's stupid. It's the dumbest. How about we try and actually identify who these people are, right? And then maybe develop a new list of these people are a high threat. Sorry,
right.
You're gone.
Yeah.
Right. So, and that's hard to do. It's for me to say that. I mean, on its face, there's a concept of it, and then there's the reality of it. For the average person, they're not going to have access to that information. They're not going to even know how to deal with that. I hate to say it, but there are certain mechanisms that only state, federal law, and I would actually push some of that responsibility back down to state and local, because they know their areas really well. I think our dependency on the federal government for all this stuff can be a mistake when you got people that live in an area where they kind of know how things have changed and the landscape of it and where people are.
Right.
I think we're missing out on that. There's a lot of local intelligence that can be drawn on. And the FBI, the DEA did a very good job of swearing in DEA agents, right, from local agencies, because number one, they needed help.
Yeah.
And number two, those people knew the area.
Some of the most valuable DEA agents that I ever encountered in my time were people who had previously been street cops doing that job, that knew frontwards, backwards, and sideways what the deal was. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And they knew how to deal with people, and they had good judgment because they'd had bad judgment at one point, right? So that's all done. So the average Fed, and I can't speak for all of them. I can speak for some of them.
Sure.
The U.S. Marshal Service has they arrest people all the time because they're going after, warrants and stuff like that, like guys who are on flight risks, or they are dangerous fleeing felons.
Mm-hmm.
So they're arresting people all the time. But you may have a guy who does an investigation for 2 years and he arrests 12 people.
Yeah.
That's it. That's his experience in putting handcuffs on people.
Right.
The average officer, one night, I might have 6 arrests in one night, 6 or 7 arrests in one night, where I'm having to deal with possibly fighting somebody in DT and being able to talk. That's a big thing, is communicating things down and dialing it down. And that kind of communication only comes from experience. And some of the best FBI agents I met were cops.
Yeah, I understand. I did more. I've run into feds and even other law enforcement officers. When I worked in Houston, I got more experience and I did more and I encountered more in 6 months than some people would their entire career. Yeah.
And it's interesting. I could kind of tell, depending on the agent I was talking, it was very rare we interface with them at a local level, but we did. We interfaced with ATF and some of those other guys too. But you could tell the guys who were probably on the street at one time, and then there are other guys that, yeah, before this I was a CPA, and now I'm working for the FBI. Yeah, you are.
Well, speaking of getting on the street, I think both of us are going to need to get on the street here in a few minutes and get on the way. You've been a great guest on this podcast. I'll just go ahead and tell you to your face, so to speak. My team down here working with you and what have you, we really appreciate you. I appreciate what you've done. I appreciate what you're still doing to help train people up and make them better. Thanks so much, Tom.
No, thank you. And your guys, let them all know they're wonderful. It was great working with them. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, we'll do it again sometime. And thank you so much. This is Charles Powell, the Dangerous Skills Podcast. We'll see you next time.
Thank you for having me.